Missouri U.S. Senator Eric Schmitt is here. He's got a new book that just dropped last week, The Last Line of Defense, How to Beat the Left in Court. Get it on Amazon or wherever you get your books. Eric Schmitt is joining us on KCMO Talk Radio. Senator, good morning. And let's just start off with the book as a whole. I mean, you talk a lot about your time as the Attorney General, 2019 to 2023, peak COVID. You're right here as the AG in Missouri. And you're fighting a lot of the nonsense, including a lot of what was happening here in Kansas City at the time. So how much love, or maybe it's a better way to put it, how much criticism does Kansas City end up getting in this book?
Well, I think that your audience will really enjoy the book because here in Missouri, whether you're in St. Louis or Kansas City or anywhere in between, we were living through this craziness. I mean, it's a lot of the great things that are happening now with President Trump we should celebrate. But you don't have to go too far back in time in the DeLorean to figure out that these are time of lockdowns and you had the compulsory COVID shots, you had the mask mandates in the schools, you had the mask mandates in Jackson County and St. Louis City and in Kansas City. You had, and then on the national level, open borders and these DEI struggle sessions. We also saw this craziness in our schools where kids were being, pushed the pyramid of oppression and all this nonsense. And so it just happened that at the time when all this was going down, I was AG in Missouri, and we led the fight. And I think it created a playbook of how you can be smart, creative, and win the important battles. But for a Missourian, this book, I think, Last Line of Defense, you said you can get it on Amazon right now. It happened in our backyard, a lot of the local stuff, and we just had the courage to stand up and fight back.
What are some of those local things that as Missourians, or obviously Kansans who follow this news cycle in Kansas City as much as anybody, what are some of those stories that people are reminded of when they're reading through this book, whether it's COVID-related, whether it's law enforcement-related, that will bring back maybe some not-so-good memories, but good memories of you obviously trying to fight some of the nonsense?
Well, I think, we had our kids were locked out of schools for a year. And if you remember, when they were coming back, the adults who should have known better were too scared or whatever to stand up and push back against this national movement to force masking on kids. That's what was happening. And if you remember, we sent a letter. There was a court case, and then I sent a letter to all the school districts in the state saying, hey, you don't have the authority to do it. The legislature never delegated you the authority to have quarantine policies or force masks on kids. And some school districts were defiant. It's interesting. We opened a parent portal, Pete, and I think this is one of the lessons that we talk about in the book for people who come after and do these other things, is when you engage the community, you multiply sort of the allies in the fight. So we had parents sending us, emails in. There was one kid, for example, who didn't want to wear a mask, who was forced to sit in the middle of a stage, in the middle of a gymnasium, isolated by himself to eat lunch. It was like a punishment. Like they were punishing these kids who didn't have to wear masks. And these adults should have known better. And then, of course, when it comes to the critical race theory and all the stuff that we uncovered, there were kids being forced to engage in things called privilege walks, where you take a step forward if you're white, take a step forward if your parents are married. And then the kids would open their eyes and look around. And what does that do? It just separates our kids. So it was a wild, crazy time that was, defined by this worldwide pandemic. People lost their minds, social unrest. We had of course, the riots in 2020. You had the defund the police movement, all this stuff, and we were standing up and pushing back. I think, though, that COVID, at the end of the book, because I've never written a book before, Pete, so there's like a lot of reflection that goes on when you write it. And there's a couple of inflection points in my life. The first is how I got into politics with my son, and I've talked about that before and his challenges. But I think the second one was COVID, because it to me, for the first time, I think power doesn't necessarily corrupt, but it does reveal. And I think COVID revealed the worst instincts of those on the left and what they would do if they had that kind of power again. And so, again, we have to use the court system to stand up and push back. Missouri led the way, and that's why I wrote the book.
When you look back on that period of time, especially in Missouri, there was an approach from leadership at the state level from the governor's office that was more of a, hey, we'll let the cities do their thing, we'll let the counties do their thing. And it was kind of a cop-out, it felt like, to many of us who were in Kansas City and some of these other parts of the state. How big of a mistake was that in hindsight, and what can we learn from it?
Well, I talk about that Missouri, you think of Missouri as this red state nationally, but we didn't have any statewide masking mandates, but that did leave a lot of authority to the locals. And in many ways, what you saw in St. Louis and Kansas City were local leaders who were trying to sort of outwoke one another for national attention. And it fell to me to do something about it. To this day, Pete, when I'm at a grocery store or somewhere in Missouri, the most frequent comment that I'll get is usually from a mom saying, hey, thanks for standing up for our kids. And businesses were destroyed over this. People lost their livelihoods because of this just nonsense. And so you have to be willing to – I think the lesson of the book, Last Line of Defense, How We Beat the Left in Court, on Amazon right now, you can get it, is that it takes courage. It really does, because, as you know, I was on your show at that time. I remember being interviewed by a local reporter in Missouri, the day we filed the lawsuits against 50-plus school districts across the state. It happened to be the peak day of Omicron, not on purpose. It just happened to be. But we filed the lawsuits, and I remember a reporter interviewing me in her car with a mask on because she still wasn't allowed in the studio to do the reporting. Like, that is just – it's a wild time. There was police tape around playgrounds. So anyway, that was sort of that aspect of it. Then, of course, we had – with Biden in office, the censorship enterprise that we uncovered in the Missouri versus Biden lawsuit. We took Fauci's deposition. You can read about that in the book. We also took Elvis Chan's deposition, the FBI agent, who was pre-bunking the Hunter Biden laptop story with all the social media giants right before the 2020 election. So there's a lot in there. There's a lot that we cover, but there's a lot of homegrown stuff. I also talk about Missouri. There was just this dichotomy when we had the bicentennial in 2021 of how people were handling these COVID restrictions. And I just think you had a clear divide between the left. It was about power and control. And I think on the right, we were fighting for freedom.
Eric Schmitt on KCMO Talk Radio. For those that don't know, what is the story of your son and how he led you into the political arena?
So Stephen is just turned 21 last week, and but was born with a rare genetic condition. He was our first child, and he was diagnosed with that at about 5 months, started having something called tuberous sclerosis, where you have tumors form in different organs of his body, including his brain. So it's very much affected Stephen's development. He's nonverbal. He'll be with us, but he has epilepsy too. He's on the autism spectrum. He has epilepsy. So he has seizures nearly every day. And when he was first diagnosed as a baby almost, and when he was a few years old, would have these massive seizures, including a 4-hour seizure. And we almost lost Stephen at one of those episodes. But going through that as a dad, I went through this process of kind of discernment. What did I want to do with my life? I was a partner at Lathrop and Gage. Things were great, and I was building a family. But reflecting on those circumstances, it kind of compelled me to want to do more with my life. And so I got into politics. And Stephen, to this day, is really an inspiration for me to try to make a difference. And so Stephen kind of got me into all this. And then as Attorney General, again, just saw the landscape of everything that was kind of coming at us. And I try to share those insights in the book.
Senator, how do you feel about Catherine Hanaway replacing Attorney General Andrew Bailey here in Missouri?
I've known Catherine for a long time. I have a ton of respect for her. I think her experience as a U.S. attorney will help her. I think that, now that you've got the Trump administration, there's different eras. I actually talk about it in the book. The difference between my first 2 years as Attorney General when President Trump was in office, we were focused on crime fighting, partnerships. Remember, we had the Safer Streets Initiative in Kansas City and St. Louis and Springfield. We partnered with Tim Garrison at the time in the Western District and Jeff Jensen to fight violent crime. And then when Biden came in, then you had COVID in 2020 and 2021, but then you had Biden come in and the left-wing lunatics took charge, and we took on a different mission, which was taking on that federal overreach. But I think there'll be some crime-fighting opportunities that Catherine Hanaway, I'm sure, will be very focused on in St. Louis and Kansas City. And I'm going to work as much as I can to get federal support for that, federal law enforcement in St. Louis. We announced some additional FBI agents in St. Louis. And we're not done yet. I'd like to see more of that, including in Kansas City.
Yeah, that's great. Well, that leads me to what we're talking about this morning here on KCMO, and that is another violent weekend in Kansas City. 2 people dead, 13th and Grand, right outside of Power and Light District. This was early yesterday morning at about 3 o'clock in the morning. So As the president obviously looks at other cities to have the blueprint that he's obviously had success with the last couple of weeks in Washington, D.C., what does it look like for maybe a Kansas City and a St. Louis when it comes to whether it's National Guard's help or something else that the Trump administration is willing to do? And how much are you willing to try to make that happen?
Yeah, I mean, these are conversations. So the backstory is when even in the transition, but then, of course, when we're going through the confirmation process with Pam Bondi and with Kash Patel, these are very early conversations I had. Hey, we need some help. And they seem very willing to do that. In fact, Kash Patel in our initial – and I've known Kash for a while, even before he got appointed to this position as director of the FBI. But he had an interest of getting FBI agents out of Washington and having more folks in the field. And I think that alignment for St. Louis and Kansas City will be very important to have additional resources who can work side by side with local law enforcement. And the truth of the matter is all these will look different depending on where you're at. But one thing that's clear, and after this failed experiment that the left toyed with in places, including Kansas City, this whole defund the police movement, it's just an utter failure. And there's no substitute for a law enforcement presence in prosecutions, right? Like, not only do you get the bad people off the streets, but, there's a deterrent effect with that too. And so, those are things that I'm going to work on, have been working on, will continue to work on. So that part of the book, Last Line of Defense, How We Beat the Left in Court, you can get on Amazon. We talk about that. That was sort of the initial phase of my time as AG. But then, of course, when Biden came in and, effectively you were going to lose your job if you didn't get the COVID shot, and schools weren't going to get their funding unless they did, critical race theory. The office took a little bit of a different mission as well.
There you go. Senator Eric Schmitt. The book will obviously, if you're a Missourian or a Kansan, and obviously you follow the news across state line, this book is going to be well worth your time. It is out. The Last Line of Defense, How to Beat the Left in Court, from Senator Eric Schmitt. Senator, thanks so much for being here. We always appreciate your time, and we'd love to do it again soon. Thanks so much.
We'll do it, Pete. Thanks for what you do.
All
Bye-bye.
right. Eric Schmitt on KCMO Talk Radio, 95.7 FM. There you go.